going to continue looking at the Hagar and Ishmael story by turning to Genesis chapter 1, reading verses 18 through 21. For the past several weeks, we've been considering this promise that God made to Abram and Sarai several chapters ago, that Sarai would conceive and give birth to a son. As we enter into chapter 21, that birth has occurred. Sarah is cuddling her son in her arms, the son that she never thought she would have. We continue now at verse 8. The child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. So she said to Abraham, "Cast out this slave woman and her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not inherit alongside my son Isaac." The matter was very distressing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, "Do not be distressed because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah asks you to do, do as she tells you. For it is through Isaac that offspring shall be named for you. As for the son of the slave woman, I will make a nation of him also, because he is your offspring." So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she cast the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot, for she said, "Do not let me look on the death of the child." And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Come, lift up the boy, and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make a great nation of him." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with water, and gave it to the boy to drink. God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother got a wife for him from the land of Egypt. Friends, this is the reading of God's holy, eternal word. To God alone be the thanks and the praise forever. Amen. Please join me in a moment of prayer. Gracious God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be found acceptable and pleasing in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. On June 2nd, 2010, the Detroit Tigers and the Cleveland Indians played what has become one of the most famous and infamous baseball games in recent history. The game is famous because for the first 26 batters that the Tigers faced that day, not a single Indian reached base. 26 up, 26 out. Their pitcher, Armando Galarraga, was approaching perfection. That's about as close as you can get to being perfect in a baseball game and still not be there quite yet. The game is infamous because of what happened to the 27th batter. On a one-ball, one-strike count, the batter, Jason Donald, hit a slow ground ball to the Tigers' first baseman, Miguel Cabrera, drawing him slightly towards second base. The pitcher sprinted to first base to cover the bag, receiving the toss from the first baseman and stepping on the bag just inches before the Indians' batter reached the bag to record the 27th out and complete the elusive, perfect game. But the umpire, Jim Joyce, saw it differently. He called the runner safe, bringing an end to Galarraga's pursuit of perfection. The Tigers players stood in stunned silence as the pitcher walked quietly back to the mound, his manager coming out of the dugout to protest the call. But this was before the days of instant replay in baseball, so there was nothing to be done but to argue. So after a little bit of disruption, the pitcher regrouped, induced a slow ground ball to the shortstop, and recorded the last out of the game. Officially, he walked off the field that day, the winner of a one-hit shutout. But everybody in attendance, including the umpire who made the faithful call, knew that it was really so much more than that. Now, of course, the next morning, the story of the perfect game that should have been but wasn't was flashed across the front page of every sports section of every newspaper in the nation. And most news networks were telling the story as well. Not just the sports networks, but the mainstream networks as well. Umpire blows it. Pitcher robbed. The perfect controversy were the leads that the anchor used to tell the story of the perfect game that almost was and should have been. The thing is that they were only telling part of the story. They were only telling the part of the story that focused on the umpire's failure and the injustice that the pitcher endured. But there was so much more to it than that. There was the courage of the umpire who stayed on the field after the game, giving the pitchers, teammates, and the managers an opportunity to vent their frustration. And then there was the integrity that he had later that evening to stand before reporters and make no excuses, to own his mistake and express his regret. There was also the class and the dignity of the pitcher who, in the heat of the moment, just as the game had ended, refused to condemn the umpire, saying quite ironically, well, nobody's perfect. There was a story to be told at the end of that game. The question was, which story was going to get told? I think this morning, as we confront our two scripture lessons this morning from the book of Genesis, we're confronted with that same kind of question. For just like the story of the perfect game that almost was and should have been, the story of Hagar and Ishmael is complicated and full of some troubling details. Quite honestly, it's an uncomfortable story to tell. And so it is a story that preachers tend to avoid because of the dark and difficult questions that they stir up. But then that sort of makes the point, doesn't it? That in the midst of this story, there is such struggle and darkness that we set it aside and rather pretend that it's not there. But in doing so, are we missing out on something wonderful? Now remember that when God first called Abram and Sarai, instructing them to go to a land that one day would belong to their ancestors, because God was promising to make a great nation out of them, they were childless, and already well beyond childbearing age. What you may not know is that 25 years of waiting separated the first time they heard the promise from the moment that the promise was fulfilled. It probably shouldn't be any surprise to us that in the midst of all of that waiting, Abraham and Sarah became impatient and decided to take matters into their own hands. Sarah took her slave girl, Hagar, and gave her to Abraham as a second wife, because maybe the needed child, the promised heir, would come through Hagar. Sounds strange to us, even maybe morally wrong. But in that day, it was a culturally accepted practice in order to keep family names alive and to lines of inheritance going forward. To them, it was a normal practice. And from the reading of the story, an effective practice. For Hagar conceived a son for Abraham and gave birth to the necessary heir. But we should note, from the very moment of Hagar's conceptions, dark clouds of tension begin to grow between the two women, Hagar and Sarah. By the time we get to our second lesson this morning, those dark clouds become a full-blown storm. Because in chapter 21, Sarah has finally, the promise has finally been fulfilled in Sarah. She is conceived and given birth to Isaac. And that's when things start to get messy. Because for Sarah, the sight of Hagar's son playing with her son, and the thought of Hagar's son sharing in her son's inheritance was more than she could bear. And so she demanded from her husband that she send the slave girl and her son away. It was troubling to Abraham, this request. I like that it troubled Abraham, this request. It troubles me just to read it, to consider somebody ask. Somebody's mother would ask that another mother and her child be thrown out into the wilderness, forgotten and ignored. It was troubling to Abraham because he loved both his sons. But God provided Abraham with an out. The promise would be fulfilled through Isaac. The nation that would grow up to be a blessing to the world would come through Isaac. So he told Abraham to obey Sarah. But he also made another promise, that Hagar's son would also become a great nation, because he also is a son of Abraham. These are the details in the story that can leave us struggling. The chosen people here don't act much like chosen people. They were called by God to be a source of blessing for the world. But I guarantee you, in that moment that Hagar was placing her son under a bush and walking off so that she would not have to watch her son die, she didn't feel much blessed. We wonder, what was it that was driving Sarah to act this way? The only thing I can think of is fear. Fear that there wasn't going to be enough for both boys. Perhaps most of that fear centered on the inheritance that Isaac would one day receive from his father Abraham, the earthly resources that would provide him security for all of his life. But I think it's more than that. I think what Sarah was defending for Isaac was his role in the promise. Was there going to be enough blessing for both boys? Could God have enough love for both boys? Is there room in God's heart for both boys? Sarah may not have known the answer to the question, but she wasn't going to wait around and find out. Is this the story we're supposed to hear this morning? Is this the story we're supposed to take home with us and reflect on? A story of the fear of scarcity that lives within each of our hearts, down there deep. We live in a world of differences. And so often these days, those differences become justification for suspicion, for fear, for violence, and rejection. We wonder, if God really loves them, can God love me when I'm not like them? We wonder, if God really loves me, can God love them if they're not like me? What hope can there be for us standing in the light of the cross if thousands of years later we're struggling with the same issues that they struggled with then? Standing in the light of the cross, what hope can there be for us if we're struggling with the same fears that held them captive then? I think it's at this point that we need to hang on with the story just a little bit longer. Because like the story of the perfect game that almost was and should have been, there's more to this story. Because the story isn't just about us and our struggle with doubt and fear. The story is also about God, who leads us in the midst of that struggle and delivers us. God met Abraham and Sarah in the midst of their struggle with barrenness. And Sarah gave birth to a son, Isaac. Sarah gave birth to a child that they named Laughter, because God had brought joy back into their life. But God also met Hagar and Ishmael in the midst of the wilderness when they were crying out in fear and desperation. And God delivered them with a promise and a reality of growing up into a great nation. God heard the cry of the boy and responded in love. This is the story we ought to be hearing this morning. The story of a God who loves with a great big love. If Sarah wondered, is there enough blessing for both boys? Is there enough love for both boys? Is there enough room in God's heart for both boys? The answer comes at the end of the story, a definitive yes. The answer comes at the end of the New Testament, the end of the Gospels, with a strong and definitive yes. For God so loved the world that he gave us his Son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life. God loves us with a big and abundant love. The story of Scripture, our story, is a story of brokenness. We've been struggling with it for generation after generation after generation. We still fail the way that they failed. We still fall short and miss the mark the way that they fell short and missed the mark. We still wonder, is there enough love for even me? The way they wondered back then. That's only part of the story. The rest of the story is that God meets us at that very point of brokenness, that very point of fear, that very point of need, and delivers us. As we tell this story this morning, as we wrestle with its dark realities, what Abraham and Sarah were capable of, what that suggests to us that we are capable of. May we hear the rest of the story. A story of hope, a story of love, a story of healing and renewal. May we hear that story today so that tomorrow and every day after it, we might tell that story to a world that needs to hear. Not just that the umpire failed, that he stood fast after the game and took the heat. Not just that the pitcher was wrong, but he stood up at the end of the game and forgave. May we hear the whole story this morning so we can tell the whole story tomorrow and every day after that. Thanks be to God. Let us pray. Gracious and sovereign Lord, we rejoice and give you thanks because today is a gift. In the midst of it, we encounter your love. Through it, we know your presence. By it, we have opportunities to serve. We thank you for the words of challenge that call us to go forth, trusting in the abundance of your love, that we might reflect that love upon the world. Lord, meet us this day and use us as your servants, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.